Okay, we're on. So thank you everyone for joining. We're going to go through the time period 1900 to the present. Just remember that every time period is equally weighted on the AP test, although there's more content in some than there are others. Unit 4 goes on and on and on and on. Just because there's a lot of content, that doesn't mean that it's weighted more. When you look at the multiple choice, all the writing on the AP test, every time period, 1200 to 1450, etc., is equally weighted on the AP test. So this is pretty important, and students tend to do not so hot on this time period on the AP test, probably because teachers don't get to finish the course because they get hung up and they never finish. So traditionally, students score lower on questions that come from this time period. So this is pretty important. That's why, again, I put a remediation that I did during COVID in 2020 to really help you with this, and it's one of those goofy cooking with Hindi videos, but you will go through that and make a timeline that will kind of reinforce some of the stuff I'm talking about right now in a little bit more detail. But nevertheless, we have 1900 to the present. Just know that things aren't going to come up on the AP tests that are about what's going on in the world right now. There will not be a question about the war in Ukraine between Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. However, if you're writing an essay, and say the essay is about Cold War, and you want to say, well, the Cold War ended in 1990, 1991, and you want to be complex, you can write, however, Cold War animosities or Cold War tension still exists today, and then you can bring in the war with Ukraine, because the U.S. is obviously supporting Ukraine to weaken Russia, and we just admitted that a week ago. So just remember, there won't be any question asked about anything right now, but if it happens, if it happened, it's history, and you can bring that in. A couple years ago, there was a SAQ that asked about technologies that sped up globalization, and students could have talked about their iPhone on that one. That would have counted. So just remember, if it's about the present, if it's in this time period, you're living in this time period. So if it's something that was on the news yesterday, you can bring it in if you're writing. Okay, so let's look at 1900 to the present. Of course, the big disruptions in this time period are World War I and World War II. So I'm going to put World War I and World War II right here. But before we get into those, there is something that happens in 1905 that hardly makes it into class, but it is mentioned as a historical development, and that is the Mexican Revolution. This has nothing to do with Cinco de Mayo from yesterday, but if you remember, in the last time period, we looked at 1750 to 1900, and 1750 began with all these political revolutions influenced by the Enlightenment. These were independence movements, such as in the United States, independence movements in Mexico and Latin America, and then full-fledged revolutions in France and in Haiti. And you should know the differences between those. If you remember, the Mexican Revolution was really an independence movement. All they did was break free from Spain. Those class tensions between the upper class, who were Spanish, and the indigenous people, who lost most of their land to the Spaniards, to the Creoles, that lasted. So the revolution, it was an independence movement. It was not a transformation of society. What you have in 1905-ish, I think it is, the Mexican Revolution is a Mexican constitution that takes away the rights of the Creoles, the privileges of the Creoles, and gives equal privileges to the indigenous people, and there were attempts to redistribute land as well around 1905. So the 1905 Mexican Revolution was about land redistribution, a fair allocation of land, because the Spanish took all the best land. So it's kind of like U.S. got its independence 1776, but it didn't really fix the social tensions of race. The Civil War is really what brought a social revolution. Political independence was the Declaration of Independence and that war with Britain. So those are two different things. So that was last year's DBQ, by the way, the Mexican Revolution. And again, you don't need to know inside and out the DBQ topics, because the documents give you the content you need to write it. Anyway, so let's look at the First World War. There's a traditional list of things that led to the war, and those things are imperialism, that intense competition between nations to get colonies first, and the engine driving that was social Darwinism. That's the idea that, you know, nations operate like members of a species, trying to get to the best resources. And if someone colonizes an area, it's off limits to you, and that limits the potential of your country to survive. So a lot of this is driven by imperialism. It's driven by nationalism, this new sense of group identity. That's very important in Unit 5. If we speak the same language, have the same religion, have the same kind of historical story, then we're a group known as the nation. And nations were very competitive in this Darwinian sense. So nationalism, and I mentioned this the other day, nationalism is going to wreak havoc on empires. So the Ottoman Empire has Greek Christians in it. Nationalism is going to stir up this fervor that we should not be ruled by Turkish Muslims. Greece got its independence in the 1830s, 1840s because of nationalism. So it's going to wreak havoc on empires, which are by definition diverse people groups. All those people groups are going to want to break away. So that is what nationalism is. And you have an arms race, the industrialization of warfare. It's going to lead to massive weapons, and every nation was trying to outdo each other. And the biggest battleship, for example, the best armor and that type of thing. So you have an arms race. You also have a system of alliances that formed where Britain and France kind of joined sides because they were fearful when Germany unified and became a nation. And so Germany allied with the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and formed the Triple Alliance. Britain and France then allied with the Russian Empire to box in Germany and Italy, and that system of alliances just upped the ante. It increased the tensions, which of course all broke out in into July 1914 when Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. That was the pretext for the war to break out. You don't really need to know about battles in World War I. You should know that it implemented industrial weapons and there were a high number of casualties. If you have to write an essay, you can name the machine gun that is actually listed as an illustrative example. You can mention poisonous gas. The tank was kind of introduced in World War I, although it wasn't nearly as developed as it would be in World War II. But you should be able to name a couple weapons of the war that led to increased casualties. So World War I comes to an end. Not surviving in the war are the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans because they sided with Germany, and then they're picked apart at the peace treaty, at the negotiations at Versailles. Britain and France colonize the former Ottoman Empire, except Turkey, which gets its own country. And that leads to problems even today with the mandate system in Palestine. I think that's in the timeline review in more detail that I put together for you for homework. The Russians fall apart because the Bolshevik Revolution breaks out. This is the communist revolution in Russia. And remember, Germany's boxed in. They got Britain and France on one side, they got the Russians on the other side. So they sneak Lenin back into Russia to overthrow the Tsar and to create the Soviet Union. And his gift back to Germany, or what he agreed to do if that happened, was to pull Russia out of the war. So now Germany doesn't have to fight a two-front war. But that created the Soviet Union. So we have World War I. Know about the Treaty of Versailles. Its attempt was to punish Germany, and all that did was it fanned the flames of German nationalism and make Germans very intensely nationalistic because it gives them a sense of victimization. The countries of the world, this is completely unfair, us having to pay back all these nations, and we lost our colonies. And in that context of humiliation and revenge and economic disaster, fascism and Adolf Hitler were ride to power on that sense of German victimization. All right, between World War I and World War II, there are two notable things that you have to know. One, you have the Great Depression, okay? And the Great Depression brings down the economies of most of the Western capitalistic democracies. It doesn't even flinch the Soviet Union because it doesn't operate by markets. The Great Depression hit countries such as the United States, Britain, and France, and so forth, and just leveled their economies. So during the Great Depression, people began to doubt whether democracy actually works because the non-democratic nations did not suffer. This is a weird time in U.S. history where more people migrated away from the U.S. than came in. And matter of fact, a couple 100,000 Americans actually moved to the Soviet Union because there was industrial work going on. Remember Stalin's 5-year plan to fix the economy and everything else. So you have the Great Depression. What you need to know about the Great Depression is that people allowed governments to become much more authoritarian during the Great Depression. They ceded more of their rights to the government just to take care of things. And you have mild examples in the United States. You have the New Deal. President FDR kind of begins to manage the economy during this time. And there's insurance, there's a unemployment compensation. If you're out of work, now you get paid for it. And you have Social Security, a retirement plan for Americans that you pay into it, then you receive at the end. There were projects. The government put people to work building dams and bridges, and that employed them. And so this is the welfare economy, meaning that the government is now looking after the welfare of its own people. It's a lot different than the Enlightenment view, where government is the referee and just makes sure the rules are being followed and people pursue their own individual property and livelihood. Now the idea is, well, in an industrial society, the government needs to take a role to help people. So you have the Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, in the New Deal in the U.S., but you have to know non-U.S. examples of this. An extreme version would be Stalin's 5-year plan, where he's going to collectivize agriculture. No more family farms. You're working on these big state farms with all the peasants working together. The government takes the grain and gives back enough for them to survive. So that's called the collectivization of agriculture. No state, no family-owned farms. And the grain that came in, Stalin sold it to fund his vision of industrialization, which is called the 5-year plan. I need to let somebody in here. Okay, so that's his 5-year plan is to fix Russia in 5 years, to catch up with everything that had been going on outside in terms of British and U.S. industrialization. So governments get more involved, and you can also talk about, I know China's not really doing that during this time period. They do that later. So you have the Great Depression, governments becoming more authoritarian and taking more control of the economic lives. And another very extreme form of that is the rise of fascism in Europe, where people cede almost all of their liberties to a single political party that allows for no other parties and is ruled like a dictatorship, where the leader and the ruling party control all state media. They control the radio and the newspapers. That is called fascism. You have it in Italy and Germany. So in Italy, Germany, you have this extreme state control of things. So that's what we have here. The other story here, so we have the Great Depression and authoritarian states. The other thing is independence movements start to rise and take form. Colonized people become less, they were never willing to go along with this, but they become less tolerant of the fact that they're colonized people. Remember, a lot of imperial nations promised independence to colonized people who would help them in the war effort. The best example is Britain telling people in India, go fight for us, fight Germans in Europe, and we'll give you independence after the war. And of course, Britain did not do that. So you have intense drive for independence. And the example that we used in class was India. You have the rise of a figurehead who becomes the face of independence. And this is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's strategy is you cannot take on the British army face to face. We'll never win. His strategy was peaceful resistance. Take the high road. Break laws that are immoral. So hence he's sitting in the spinning wheel making his own clothes when the British made that illegal. The British wanted Indians to buy clothes from their factories. The Salt March is a famous episode where Gandhi led this massive march that got bigger and bigger as they went to the sea to harvest salt, as Indians had done for centuries and centuries. Gandhi was arrested, and that really made the British look bad. And you also have the organization called the INC, the Indian National Congress, becomes well organized. And the British is forcing people, middle-class Indians, to learn English. So that becomes very easy for them to have a unified front against the British. Now that doesn't come to fulfillment until after World War II. But you have the organization, a better organized independence drive between World War I and World War II. So we get to World War II. Again, you don't need to know battle by battle by battle. It's aggressiveness of Nazi Germany, of course, wanting to retake land that was taken back from them at the Treaty of Versailles. So they invade Poland, which was made up of land taken from them. They seize Austria and Czechoslovakia. They attack France, and then they attack the Soviet Union. Again, you don't need to know all of that, but in World War II, you have new weapons of war again. The atom bomb enters the war at the end, and this is the United States. You have massive civilian casualties and atrocities, which you knew before this class. In World War II, civilians were often the targets. They didn't die because they were near targets. They were often the targets. And you all know about the Holocaust. By the way, in World War I, you had the first genocide, where the Ottoman Turks massacred Armenians in the part of the Ottoman Empire that bordered Russia, because they blamed them for how easily Russia invaded, so they killed 1 million Armenians. So you have these massacres in this time period. World War II ends, and a huge section of the last part of the 20th century is two trends that go in parallel that are somewhat related but really dominate the globe. So let's talk about them. So after World War II, you have, first of all, the Cold War. World War II is going to level the impact and the wealth of Britain and France and all these previous empires. They just can't hold on to empire anymore. India gets its independence because of that. So you have the Cold War leveled all these nations and left the US and the Soviet Union, who were allies against Hitler, but as soon as the war was over, they were no longer friends. The US and the Soviets had very different visions on how they wanted to rebuild the world. And that struggle between them is called the Cold War, because it's cold because the US and Russia never fought at each other. But you should know some examples of the proxy wars, and I made previous videos about that. Korea, later on Vietnam. These are times when the US is supporting people that are fighting people being supported by the Soviet Union or China. So that's the Cold War. And when the Soviets got nuclear weapons, it raised the stress level of the Cold War, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I also made a video about and is in the review video you'll watch, where the US and Russia almost went to nuclear war because Russians had nukes in Cuba. So you had that intense Cold War. Two nations with different economic ideologies, capitalism and communism, trying to remake the world in their own image. Now, a different topic that is similar to that, the Cold War, is decolonization. So what's decolonization mean? It means we're in the Great Scramble for Africa, the Raj in India after the Sepoy Rebellion, all that colonization that took place on that second great wave of imperialism that was driven by industrial nations. All those places get independence after World War II. This is the most rapid decolonization that history has ever seen. It created I think 100 or 80 or something like that. Dozens and dozens of brand new nations were created after World War II because those imperial powers were so weakened by the war. You have that scramble for Africa you saw back in the 19th century is just reversed, and you get independence all over Africa. India gets independence. China breaks its themselves free from having those spheres of influence where the British and the Russians and the Japanese had control of areas of China, and they become communists in 1949 and become independent from all that. So that's what decolonization is about. Here's what the topic pages tell you should know about decolonization. You should know some examples and be able to dig deep into one of them if you have to write an essay about this. But in a nutshell, there were two approaches to decolonization. Some nations peacefully negotiated their independence. So India, for example, negotiated with Britain to get independence after World War II. Now, there were issues with Muslims and Hindus after independence. That was a different affair, but Britain didn't send soldiers to try to stop India from revolt. India negotiated peacefully its independence. On the other side of this, you had places that had to fight for their independence. And Algeria, by the way, I have a podcast that compares these two and goes deep into this. That's on History Haven. Algeria was a settler colony in North Africa. French, they didn't colonize Algeria to get its resources. They colonized it for French people to move there. And so that was a very difficult struggle for independence because the people who were in control there were the whites, the French, who simply did not want to see their home go back to Algerian control. They wanted France to continue control. And so they were the biggest impediment to independence, and it turned into a terrible, bloody affair, the Algerian War for Independence, that finally was successful in the 1960s. So that's a bloody struggle. Another one that really shows the link between Cold War and decolonization is what happens in Vietnam, where the French have to leave Vietnam because they just can't hold on to it anymore. But the independence movement in Vietnam is led by Ho Chi Minh, a communist. So independence means Vietnam will be a communist nation. So the U.S., which is all for independence, that's how we started, looked at Vietnam and said, not this time. It will lead to the spread of communism. So the U.S. went in there to try to stop that and try to shut down Ho Chi Minh and the North Vietnamese. And it led to, until the U.S. went into Afghanistan after 9/11, this struggle in Vietnam was the longest conflict the U.S. has ever been in. It was over 20 years, and the U.S. lost. So the U.S. loses the Vietnam War. Vietnam gets its independence, and none of the fears that the U.S. had that it would lead to a spread of communism across the world, none of that actually happened. But you have this struggle in Vietnam that shows the relationship between the Cold War, we don't want communism to spread, and decolonization, where a nation breaking free from colonialism would be communism if they won that. So these are the two big trends that you see after World War II. I think in the 80s you still had a few nations that got their independence. So for the most part, from 1946, 1947, up until a few countries in the 70s and 80s, you have this massive decolonization in the world. Please remember that some nations did not take sides in the Cold War. They were called non-aligned nations. We're not going to pick sides. We don't want to be on the U.S. side. We don't want to be on the Soviet side. And again, in my podcast, I'll talk about the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, where a group of Indonesian countries and other countries said, no, we're just not taking sides. India did not want to play that game. Egypt, ruled by Nasser, did not want to take sides in the Cold War. So that's important to know. Now, last topic, and this will be reiterated in the video assignment that you're doing next week. The end of the Cold War. Now, I made a video about this that you're supposed to have watched already, so I'm not going to go into details about the end of the Cold War. But this is like 1989 to about 1991, about right here. About right here. So 1989 to 1991. 1989 is when the Berlin Wall came down that separated the communist and the free side of Berlin. 1991 was the last year that the Soviet Union was in existence. So there are economic reasons for this, there are informational reasons for this, and the U.S. built an incredible arms buildup, and also the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan and that became their Vietnam. You know, Vietnam really humiliated the United States. The U.S. had never won a war before, and here a poor country defeated the U.S. That's what Afghanistan was for the Soviets, who invaded in 1979 and would fight all the way to 1989. You know, peasants, people who are not sophisticated in terms of their technology, brought down or defeated the Soviet Union, and it was equal humiliation for them. So the Soviet Union breaks apart into 15 countries, and what you have now is this incredible era of globalization. And you should know this from a previous video. The two hallmarks of this are the fall. I think 1992 is the best year to understand this, because in 1992, two things happen. The Soviet Union has just broken apart, and since the Cold War is over, the U.S. takes its connectivity, the infrastructure they built to share content from across its military. So if the Russians took out its mainframe computer, that content would still be, you know, distributed across the United States. They made that public, and that was called the World Wide Web, which today is the Internet. So with the fall of the Soviet Union and the launch of the Internet, the connectivity of the world becomes absolutely intense. So you have cultural aspects of this, you have economic aspects of this, and again, I reiterate some of this in the video. You should know some organizations like the World Trade Organization, which is a big club countries join to freely trade with each other. Regional trade agreements like the EU, the European Union, and NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. Those are adjacent nations that make it very easy to trade, and NAFTA is Canada, the US, and Mexico. So there's some things here that you should know. But what I want to stress right now, which isn't in a previous video, is the environmental aspects of what we have going on here. In the 1960s and 70s, there's kind of a new consciousness about the environment. You need to know that the industrialization increased greenhouse gases, which is put CO2 in the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is more prone to temperature change than regular atmospheric air. And so the argument is that more CO2 causes the greenhouse effect, which causes climate change. And it's kind of controversial topic, but just, you know, leave that aside. There is climate change, and the reason for it is sometimes debated, but nevertheless, you need to understand this, and there are organizations called Greenpeace and the Sierra Club that are meant to try to preserve aspects of the environment. You have glaciers that are now extinct. There's one in Iceland that they just declassified as a glacier because it doesn't exist anymore. So there is that climate change that's going on, and a lot of this comes from the Industrial Revolution and the industrialization that's still going on today with the internal combustion engine. I think we pretty much covered the nuts and bolts of 1900 to the present, just to kind of give you a look at things. Previous essays that came from this are, there was an SAQ about independence movements, and basically the SAQ showed a picture of a armed guy. It was Che Guevara from Latin America, and you had to mention what was significant about that and what other area didn't use those strategies. And all you had to do is see that he had a weapon and know that some areas fought for their independence while some areas negotiated their independence. There was an LEQ, which I gave you this week to write. That's how global conflicts transformed political structures of the globe. And global conflicts is how what the College Board calls World War I, World War II, and possibly the Cold War as well. So how did World War I and World War II, how did these events transform the structure of the world? And that was a pretty easy LEQ to write because the evidence, as long as you know the terminologies, what global conflicts meant, then that should be an easy thing for you to do. One reason I continually stress that you should be using the topic pages, because the topic pages yield the vocabulary used on essay questions and other questions on the AP test. So they might not say the world wars in the 20th century. They may say global conflicts because that's the name of the actual unit or the name of that topic page. So that's why I encourage you to write on those things a lot. Okay, so we're going to wrap it up here. Again, you will have some things next week. Another video that I do where you'll actually fill out a timeline on some of this, and then a more significant last-ditch content reinforcement assignment due next week. So I will see you guys later.